Football Manager is an incredibly immersive game.
This could spell danger. It's in.
And it's not just the in-game experience that is immersive.
Motoring forward to the back post. And how good was that?
In theory, you can take over a team from anywhere in the world and lead them to international importance. And in theory, the game should accurately reflect the local nature of whatever place you're managing in.
Really well taken goal.
Well, in theory, that is. In reality, it's kind of complicated. And unfortunately, Football Manager's pre-game editor has actually lost functionality over time. And we don't see that more clearly anywhere than with languages. Well, a little while ago, I started a save using the recent North American Football Association mod. I like this mod, but there are some things that drive me nuts. For one thing, everybody speaks French, has French names, and is a French citizen. And this is incredibly immersion breaking. Now, the irony here is that I wanted to manage a team in Rockville, Maryland, mostly because of the large Chinese-speaking population in that area. And it just so happens that my family and I visited Rockville only a few days ago. This was for a boba tea festival put on by the local Taiwanese community. Now, Rockville is kind of an odd Chinese-speaking enclave in the middle of the Washington, D.C. suburbs. It's unique in that it's developed a bit of a local cultural flavor. It's a nice change from the normal defense contractors and ugly concrete buildings that you see elsewhere in the region. And this is really the sort of thing that I was hoping to see reflected in this modified database. After all, if you're going to manage a team in a certain part of the world, you want to feel like you're really there. But unfortunately, it's really hard to make it so that Football Manager will generate local players that accurately reflect this cultural phenomenon, and I'll show you why. Okay, part of the problem comes from the North American Football Association editor data file itself. So look at this, the Northeast states has French listed as the default language, likely because the creator forgot to change this. However, there's another problem, one that is hidden and that we simply cannot see. You see, in versions of Football Manager from like a decade or so ago, you could actually delete and create nations at will. However, starting around FM19, this functionality was taken away due to hard-coded settings that we can't see or change in the editor. Additionally, it seems that many of the French-speaking enclaves have certain settings hard-coded that ensure that generated players will have French as a second nationality. And there are also reports that CONCACAF competitions simply cannot be edited anymore like they could once upon a time. So the problem is that Sports Interactive has gotten into the habit in recent years of just hard-coding changes into the game instead of allowing them to be edited. The more the things are hard-coded, the more the things will break if you try to mess with them. And this is why you don't see as many total conversion mods for Football Manager as you once did. But then again, that's not necessarily a problem. We don't have to completely destroy MLS and put something new in its place after all. There are other setups that we can mess around with if we like the World Super League, my personal favorite. And it's clear from parts of World Super League, like this Remove All Other Leagues add-on, that you can make sweeping changes to Football Manager to at least some extent, even with the hard-coded issue. It seems that the trick here was to simply make everything else extinct. I don't know if that might be a helpful solution to the hard-coded Major League Soccer issues or not, but I figured that I would show that anyway. There's a lot of really strange stuff that's hidden in Football Manager. However, in my mind, the biggest issue isn't just leagues that you can't change, it's these hard-coded language settings. I've talked about Dave INCID's mods quite a few times before. They're excellent, but there are also a few problems. In particular, if you care about football in Northeast China, you will notice some major issues. So years ago, Yanbian FC was the representative team in the Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture in Jilin Province. I should probably explain a little bit about this actually. Yes, there is a Korean prefecture in China not too far from the North Korean border. Yes, the people there are actually Chinese citizens, not North Korean citizens. And surprisingly, yes, Korean is one of the official government languages in that area. In fact, you can find Chinese ID cards from that region that are written in both Chinese and Korean, which I guess is sort of a rarity for China. local television stations broadcast in the Korean language, and it's not hard to find Korean books in local bookstores. So I happen to speak both Chinese and Korean. I went to a bookstore once over in that part of the world and chatted with the cashier while I was buying a few books. I could switch in the conversation from Chinese to Korean with each sentence, and she didn't even bat an eye. She also didn't seem to find it strange that a blonde guy like me could speak both languages. It's an interesting place, to say the least. Anyway, the current major team from that prefecture is Yanbian Longding. Start a new save with the default settings and you will notice that a bunch of Yanbian Longding new gens come from the Yanbian Autonomous Prefecture. And interestingly enough, most of them will speak both Chinese and Korean. This is accurate, by the way. In that prefecture, something like 60 to 70% of young people speak both Korean and Chinese, mostly because they were born in families that were ethnic Korean. However, if you use that Dave INC ID language pack, things change dramatically. With that pack on, the locally born new gens tend to speak Mandarin, not Korean. And with older players, you'll run into a strange problem where they speak both Chinese and Mandarin. And this is an issue that's caused by the mod. I'll show you, in fact, but first we've got to look in general at how languages work in the game. Now, we saw in the NAFA database that countries can have languages assigned to them. To find that, you go to the nation, go to relationships on the left side, and then languages. So for example, in China, you'll get Chinese as 100%. I don't know this for certain, but I believe that that means 100% of all players created in that nation will speak that language. Compare that with the default settings for the United States, for example. There, English is 100% and Spanish is 50%. Now, the actual Spanish-speaking population of the United States is more like 20%. But there's a good argument that the football-playing population of the United States is much more likely to speak Spanish as a second language than the average person. Or in other words, you might not want to just copy and paste the language frequency data from Wikipedia into the pregame editor. Now we can look at the local regions. Jilin Province shows up as Jilinsheng in the local region in Football Manager. As you can see, Chinese is set at 100% here as well. However, you can also set local languages at the city level. So if you do a search for the city Yanji, which is the capital city of the Yanbian Prefecture, you get this page. And as you can see, the language for the city is set to Korean. The same is true for other Korean autonomous prefecture cities, for example Ontu and Hunchun and Longjing. Now the interesting thing is that having a city speak a certain language is not a 100% guarantee that all new gens from that city will speak that language. However, it makes it a very, very strong possibility. And the other interesting thing is that you can screw things up if you start messing around with the wrong languages. Let's look at that Dave INCID language file. As you can see here, he has created a language called Mandarin, which I believe is intended to represent what they call Putonghua in Chinese. This originally came from Simplified Chinese, which is a language that comes with the game by default for some strange reason. And there's traditional Chinese as well. Now, players from China don't speak Simplified Chinese by default. It's not clear why this is in the game at all, other than that it's part of some bizarre spaghetti code. Maybe there was something they tried to do a couple years ago, but when you start really messing with this stuff, you'll get really bizarre results. That's this problem where you get players who speak both Mandarin and Chinese. I think this is due either to player-specific language settings or to something hard-coded that can't be changed. Additionally, in this mod, the cities in Yanbian are set to be Mandarin-speaking, and Jilin Province is set up like this with 4% of the speakers speaking Korean. Now that more or less matches what it says on Wikipedia. But that's inaccurate for the local area. In fact, if you turn the Yanbian Prefecture into Chinese only, you will lose all of the local flavor. And that's not the only issue that this language mod creates. I know most of you aren't going to manage in Taiwan, but it's still interesting to see what happens here. By default, Taiwan simply speaks Chinese. However, with the Dave INCID mod, Taiwan chiefly speaks what they call Guoyu, the local term for Chinese. Note as well that a significant part of the population speaks Taigi. Taigi, of course, is Taiwanese Hokkien, which technically is called Southern Min. but note that only 83% of the population now speaks Guoyu, which is pretty inaccurate. Actually, if you were to become a professional footballer in Taiwan, you would have to speak Chinese or Guoyu, since you would have to have at least a basic education. And this also doesn't account for the fact that Guoyu in Taiwan is more or less the same language as Putonghua in China. This is a huge issue if you manage in these countries. So, for example, if you're managing in Taiwan with this mod and you sign a mainland Chinese player, you have to send him off to language school to learn Chinese again. In other words, this mod creates linguistic differences that don't actually exist in real life. And that leads me to another issue, one that impacts languages in the game in general. The issue is this setting here, the difficulty of learning a language. Sure, if you're an English speaker or from Western Europe, Korean is going to be really hard to learn. But it's not going to be that hard to learn if Japanese is your mother tongue, for example. You see, the problem the Football Manager has here is that so much of this game is binary. In other words, a language is either difficult or easy, with no real consideration for how language families actually work. And that can really destroy immersion when you manage in certain countries. Anyway, there's really not a great solution out there to these problems. However, I can say for certain that you're better off creating language-specific cities than assuming that regional settings will do the job for you. As a test, I set up a few Chinese-speaking parts of Flushing, New York as a local area just to see what would happen. And as I expected, I wound up with New York City FC Academy new gens who came from these places and who spoke the local language as well as English. It did screw a few other things up though. I had a lot of non-Chinese new gens who suddenly spoke Chinese for some hidden reason. But at least it showed me that the city language settings can help add in some linguistic local flavor. Anyway, you might wonder in the end whether it's even worth messing around with this stuff. And the truth is that language in Football Manager doesn't really impact anything. It's all about immersion. But immersion really is a thing. So if I'm playing Football Manager and I'm going to coach a team in southern Taiwan, I want to feel like I'm actually coaching in southern Taiwan. Anyway, hopefully some of this will help you as you mess around with your own editor data. And I really hope that FM26 has fewer of these ridiculous hard-coded settings.